and connect and support more than usual.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes. Like, hallelujah to that. But, I see it sometimes in a different way than administrators supervising multiple teams. But I think that's good advice for any organization who right now is working with groups of people. So, yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I want to get back to something we were talking about a minute ago, and that was about staff turnover. So when we were back in February at the Best Foot Forward conference, I said before I was in your presentation, and something that you said during that presentation really resonated with me. You talked a lot about the real cost of hiring staff. So in our field, like before COVID-19, we had a lot of turnover. It was 40%, I think is what you said. And there's a cost in administrative time to find and interview and train these folks. And now we have the additional burden of trying to find staff who can and want to work, right, at this moment, at a time when they are really critically needed. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about the past and the current state of hiring in our field and what is best practice as far as like, what really, when you put the rubber to the road, what's really the real cost of this?
I would start by saying, before we get into practical suggestions or what the research shows us, so much of this, like everything else, is a mindset shift. Right. Because it was funny actually at your conference, but in other conferences too, when I'm mingling and networking or sitting having lunch, and it will come up, oh, what are you doing? I'm presenting. What are you presenting on? And when I say high quality staff,
hey,
almost
can you
inevitably.
Stop for a second?
Yes.
You cut out there for a moment.
Oh, okay.
Would you mind starting back from just the last sentence?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
So it's interesting at your conference and other places I go when I'm presenting on this topic and I'm talking with people and chit-chatting and it comes up about what I'm presenting. And almost inevitably, someone will say, well, it's all about the money, or we don't have the money, so that's all there is to it, right?
Right.
And that's a common belief. And so if your belief is that our hands are tied, there's nothing to be done, then you're not going to try to do anything better, right? And so it requires both, not a naivete. We understand that money's a big part of this equation, but a sort of motivation to say to ourselves, yes, money is a big piece of this puzzle, but it's not the only piece. So as we continue to advocate, and that's a huge part of this, making changes on the systemic level, advocating with boards and funders and grant makers and foundations about why it's important to pay staff more. That is slower, harder work. But while we continue to do that work, there are things to be done that don't have to do with money. And to inform the conversation, I think it's really important that people understand this is costing money anyway. So when you say we only have it in our budget to pay our staff $10 an hour, $12 an hour, whatever it is that you pay, that's a little bit easier math, right? Because it's very black and white. This is our budget. This is how much we can pay. But what I encourage programs to do is to dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, so you only have $10 an hour to pay your staff, but your staff is turning over 40%. So every time you hire a new staff, here's the cost. Here, so I have them do an exercise. So sit down and try to estimate how many hours go into a hiring. And very often people look just at the interviews. And I say, no, back up. You're updating the job description. You're posting it. You are going through resumes. You're doing the interviews, another round, right, and whatever. And so depending on your hiring process, it could be, I've seen people say it's up to 60 to 75 hours they put into their hirings,
I would believe that, I would have no problem with that. Yep.
And so if whoever's on that hiring team, if you figure out how much money you would make per hour, even if you're salaried, you can do the math and figure out what your hourly rate is. Now tell me how much it costs to hire that person. Right. And if you're able to pay a couple dollars more per hour or offer some benefit or something in your compensation package, it's going to be less than what you're paying for this constant turnover. So I think that's important for people to understand. It's still costing you money. In fact, it's costing you more money. And it's costing you time and institutional wisdom and staff morale. And you cannot sustain a strong program if you're constantly cycling people who don't yet know how to work in your program. Right.
And, you know, and so, you know, back when I was an administrator, when I had someone turn in their 2 weeks, right, I'm like, well, this is a 60-day process by which I will not be working, because I will be on program site now. And so I think, you know, my cost, but also the cost of the work that does not get done in the organization, right? While you are filling in positions where you now have gaps. And also, you know, including that human resource person, you know, I never thought about how, you know, you're leaning into that person as well and using their time to help hire and train another person too. So, I mean, there are all kinds of things that we need to consider in that equation that, you know, often I think that we don't. So, yeah, I mean, really, really interesting to think more about this. So where do organizations start? Like if they're deciding that they're going to do this, we're going to really look at this. Where do they begin?
So they begin at the beginning, and to begin at the beginning is
right. Okay, that makes sense.
You begin at the beginning, and to begin at the beginning means that you start to do what you can to make this better, and you don't have to do it all at once. I think what happens with a lot of change, organizational change, it can be overwhelming, right? Like we're going to audit and update our hiring process or our program or whatever it is, and it feels so big and overwhelming that either it doesn't happen, or much like the communication, I'm going to wait till it's all done before I start making any changes at all, right? And so my suggestion is, and one of the handouts that I give during my presentation that I'm happy to share, it's literally just a blank chart. But what it says is it takes every step of the hiring process. So job description, posting, resume review, first round interview, second round, and it just goes through what are all the steps of your hiring process. And the next column says, what am I doing now? And then the final column says, how could I do it a little bit better? Right? And there's so many pieces in the process that you can start first by examining what your current process is. That's always where we start. What are we doing now? And then where can we start to make these little changes as we work on the big changes? So maybe it's something like we've used the same job description for 9 years, right? And it's not up to date. So maybe that's your first step, is you update your job description. Or you say, we have absolutely no orientation for new staff. They come in, they sign the employee handbook, and they're literally in program the same day. Wow, not great practice, right? So while we flesh out a really good, intentional, effective orientation process, maybe we can say, for the time being, we sit for an hour and explain to them what the program is, right? So just start to make the little changes as you work on the big ones. And I think one thing that we don't do so much, I tend to go a lot externally, right? What does the research say? How do you hire? What interview questions do you use? That stuff's great, but sometimes we forget to look internally. So if you look at your current staff, you can get great data from your current staff, right? who sticks around at this program, right? And why? And how did we get our the folks on our team who we consider high quality, where did they come from? How did we get them? How did we identify that they were high quality, right? What did we see in them during the process? And then start to use your own data and your own patterns to say, oh, there's a commonality here between the folks who stick around and are really great. You don't want retention if folks aren't that great either, right? It's not retention.
No, you don't. No, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, it's not retention for retention's sake. It is high quality staff retention. Yeah. And the thing I always suggest that we don't do in most organizations is what we call stay interviews. So a lot of organizations have some version of an exit interview, but very few organizations do what we call stay interviews, which is asking your staff who sticks around, what makes you stick around? Right. I mean, it's good to ask people who are leaving, why did you leave? But it's really, really invaluable to ask the people who stay, what makes you stay? And how can we hold on to you for another year?
Right.
And you can get really powerful information from that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, what if we're trying to find a high quality staff person? What kinds of things would you be looking for if you were a supervisor?
So, we're in a field that there's not. Like for teaching, for example, you have to have a certain certification to have a certain job, right?
Yes.
We're in a field where we kind of arbitrarily assign certifications on an organization by an organization basis because we don't have them field wide. And some organizations are very particular where you have to have a background in education or sociology or social work or something related.
Yeah.
Some organizations are not so particular to that, but we don't have a standard. You need this qualification to work here, right? So each organization sort of does it on their own. And until we get there, I think we'll get there eventually, but I think we're a long way away from that. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, like most jobs, I think we need to understand that quality people matter. And we get very enamored by experience. And this is true not just in the after school world, this is true in every field.
Right.
That, oh, you've been doing this for 20 years, so great, right? But I was reading this really fascinating article on the Harvard Business Review that said experience doesn't translate very well because just because you've worked somewhere or in a field for a certain amount of years doesn't mean you were doing a great job at it. So what we need to think about is we want good people on board. Right. We want people who are dedicated and reliable and willing to learn and grow and receive feedback, and they're good players and they get along with others and they're a positive influence on staff, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that having experience in the field that it's not always valid. What am I saying? I'm stumbling. So it's great if you can hire someone who has lots of experience in the field and knows what they're doing, but it's not the one main indication. So I like to focus on high quality, talented people. Mm-hmm. So in interviews, as I'm getting to know, there's only so much you can flesh out from an interview.
Yes,
we know that.
True. Yes.
And so what I like to do in interviews is to get a sense of what their values are, what their motivations are, what they're about. And we always, in places I've worked, I've implemented a system where when we get to the final stage of interviewing, they have to have some interaction with the youth and families. Yes. So ideally, we have them come in and do a little lesson or an activity or something to see how they connect and interact with the kids. Ideally, we have kids and their parents in a session of the interviewing so they can ask questions and be a part of the process, because you can learn a lot watching someone come in to deliver a lesson